I believe we have with us now Stephen Miles, who is with the group, and I always get this wrong, World Without War. I believe I've gotten that right. If he is with us, he will correct me on it. We'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East. Stephen, are you with us?
I am, and it's win without war.
I always get that wrong. Whatever it is, I think it's the opposite. I'm sorry about that, but it's Win Without War. And
Both are
thanks
good
so much for
ideas. Both
joining.
are good ideas.
I totally agree. All right, I won't go off on World Without Love or Peter and Gordon or anything. Listen, so the situation is proceeding in the Middle East. We had, understandably, a lot of people were deeply, and rightfully, a lot of people were deeply upset by the ISIS video showing the beheading of journalist James Foley. We have escalating tensions. We have calls for in the military for bombing in both Syria as well as Iraq against the so-called ISIS state. I would argue it is neither Islamic nor a state, but it calls itself IS, or Islamic State. And I think the left is divided and struggling with its own conscience on this issue. So, first of all, I guess I would say, have I left anything out of my update? And secondly, like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good roundup. I'll say I think it's less that folks are divided than the reality is that we once again find ourselves facing a situation in which there's a tremendous amount of human suffering. There's a strong desire to do something about that suffering, and we're confronted with the reality where there are very few and very possibly no good options, and a series of options that are varying degrees of bad that we're trying to choose amongst. And so that's where we find ourselves today. This isn't a new conflict. We see kind of daily images, and some of them, like you mentioned, with the execution of the journalist James Foley, are incredibly shocking and bring this home to us in a way that we haven't quite felt it before. But the reality is this is a conflict that's been going on kind of in Syria for the last 3 years. And in some ways, this is a conflict that's been going on for the last 11 years since our original invasion of Iraq back in 2003. So it's unfortunately not new. The kind of spike we're seeing now is a kind of unfortunate reminder of just how horrible things are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and of course, there's a Sunni versus Shiite angle to all this, which in many ways seems to parallel tribal and regional divisions as much as just theological. I think in many cases it's not so much theological as the theology comes up from tribal and regional differences that are equally long-standing. I mean, I think it's striking, for example, was reading more about the guy who seems to be running the IS operation, which is, he calls himself a caliph. He calls himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and if you know your Middle Eastern history, Abu Bakr was the first caliph after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. He is now the Shiites wanted the caliph to be Ali. Instead, Abu Bakr was chosen, so that's already an anti-Shiite gesture as far as I can tell, and he's the al-Baghdadi means from Baghdad, of course, and he, from what I was reading, was an American prisoner in one of the American camps, and before that was a sort of a street gangster more than a political or theological figure. Do you know about him? Do you know if, in fact, that's the case?
Yeah, he was a prisoner during the original Iraq War, in American custody for a while, and met some of the folks he's got reportedly in senior positions within ISIS or the Islamic State. Met him while in prison, met them while in these U.S. detention facilities, and you're right to say a lot of this is kind of the Sunni Shia divide, but it's a lot more complicated than that actually. And just when you look at even one theoretically faction, the ISIS fighters, you see within them kind of lots of different people who are fighting with them for lots of different reasons. Some of them are kind of true believers of this radical brand of Wahhabism that believes in kind of this perverted ideology that they profess to be leaders of. Others are simply kind of paid mercenaries, for lack of a better term, who fight with them because they pay more than any of the other militias around. Some of them are the former Ba'athist members of the Saddam regime who were leaders and military leaders and government leaders of one form or another, and have been kind of banned during the period after the fall of Saddam as part of the de-Baathification, and kind of have nowhere else to go. And then even more, some of them are local tribesmen, some of the very folks that were on our side when we fought many of these same people as part of the Anbar awakening back in 2006, 2007, when the Sunni tribes decided to turn against the predecessor to ISIS, which was then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and now are kind of back on that side after becoming disillusioned with the Maliki government. So, and that's just one faction of the fight in Iraq. And when you broaden out and you talk about the broader conflict, what you're looking at is something stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, with literally dozens of different factions, and people are fighting for various different reasons, and it's incredibly complex. And I have to say, unfortunately, after decades of being involved in the Middle East, we still have an uncanny ability to singularly understand the situation poorly when we try to look at it from afar.
Well, and I think also to singularly do that thing which will act against our own and everyone else's best interest sometimes. I mean, to a certain extent, that's what I was getting at by mentioning the imprisoning of the caliph, so-called caliph, who was then able to network in prison with his senior executives, whatever he calls them, and also presumably was more radicalized by that experience, and the arms that, the money that they're paying their militia members is money that they're getting through unsecured U.S. arms, among other things, and the Baathists that were fired by Brewer or whatever the governor general was under Bush, another bad call. They are now fighting for the other side. So it seems that when we understandably, as you put it, want to step in. I quoted during one of my news breaks, I think I meant to quote Bill Kristol saying, let's just bomb him for a few weeks. Nothing bad or unforeseen could happen. Let's just see how it goes. That we seem to do a lot of things, sometimes in the interest of trying to help, that make the situation worse, and that if anything should be a sign that we ought to move very, very carefully from this moment forward. Am I missing something?
No, I mean, nowhere on earth is the law of unintended consequences more on display than in America's policy towards Iraq. I mean, we have just, despite our best intentions, caused some of the very problems we're now struggling with through our actions. You cannot talk about Iraq and Syria today without understanding how much of that was caused by the decision of the Bush administration to go to war there in 2003, and all of the consequences that come from that. And this is why it's important to understand that when you have these kind of deep humanitarian suffering in situations like we see now, you have to understand that the reality is that we can make it worse despite our best intentions. We may be trying to save lives at times, yet ultimately prolong the suffering, prolong the conflict, make the conflict worse. And that's what we have to guard against. It's the old adage, first do no harm. That really needs to be our mantra.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I'm going to want to get into that a little more. But I think just to round off the circle about us, doing harm where we may even not intend to, it seems to me that a year ago we were, and I actually do need a reality check with you on this, because my head is kind of twisted a little bit, but it definitely seems to me that a year ago we were arming people who were fighting against Assad, and now when we talk about bombing ISIS in Iraq, we're talking about bombing the people who are fighting against Assad, who presumably are the same people we were talking about, or some of the same people we were talking about arming last year.
Yeah, that's you're exactly right. The notion that we are today talking about intervening in the middle of a civil war in Syria on completely the opposite side that we were about to intervene last year, if nothing else, should cause us all to take a giant step back and say, what is going on here? What are we talking about? You know, we were hours away, by all measure, from bombing Syria last year. We may be on the verge of bombing Syria again this year, but in the intervening year, the consequences of our bombing would have 180 degrees the opposite effect. This is the reality of what happens when you get involved in the middle of a kind of multifaceted conflict, and it's impossible to, again, despite your best intentions, it's impossible to simply wish away the inevitable consequences of what we're talking about doing.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and then we'll take a break and maybe talk about approaches that would work, but it seems to me that we're constantly being manipulated emotionally, and I say that not because I have a lack of compassion for everybody that's suffering. I do, but a year ago we were seeing the horrific pictures of that young boy who was tortured to death by Assad's people. Now we're seeing the images of James Foley. They're both ghastly and horrifying, but you can find them on both sides, and we need to have a talk about how to reduce the suffering in a way that doesn't inflame one side at the expense of the other. So maybe when we come back from a break, we can talk a little bit more about this. But we're talking with Stephen Miles from Win Without War about the conflict in Iraq and Syria, how to think about it, what we might do about it. So I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour talking about the situation in Iraq with Stephen Miles, who is advocacy director for Win Without War, a diverse coalition of 40 member organizations formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the underlying national security strategy that created them. And when we went to break, we were talking about we're always reacting to the last horror, the horror of the child that Assad's forces tortured to death, the horror of James Foley's beheading, and of course they're on opposite sides of this conflict, Assad in Syria and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Now we seem to be wanting to attack ISIS in Iraq, which would benefit Assad, so we've kind of switched there. What's the way out? How do we get out of this thing?
Well, the short answer, as we said at the outset, is that there is no quick, easy way out. We have to kind of acknowledge that and accept that unfortunate reality. You know, we all want to be able to pick up the phone and make a call or push a button, and it's going to make the human suffering that we're seeing in Iraq and Syria end. It's totally understandable that we want to do that. Unfortunately, that's not in the cards. There's just too many people fighting too many different wars for too many different reasons going on all at the same time. And part of what has to happen is that the people on the ground have to decide they don't want to fight those battles anymore. At the root cause of both conflicts, both in Iraq and Syria, what you have is you have a massive amount of people who are non-represented by the political institutions, the governments that are supposed to represent them, and they want the understandable human dignity, the ability to influence their lives, the ability to have some say over the lives that they want to live, and that's denied to them, both in Iraq and both in Syria. In Syria, the Assad government is brutally repressive, clearly not representative of a large majority of its people. In Iraq, the Sunni population, which was previously in power, has been completely and utterly kind of taken out of government by the Maliki government. So what has to change, part of what has to change is those governments have to be changed, those institutions have to be changed so that people can feel like they have a say, they have a way of expressing themselves simply other than trying to fight and kill one another. And until that happens, you can limit the fighting. We can go send Americans back in there to try to stand between the parties so that they stop fighting. We can take some of the worst offenders off the battlefield with bombs. But the root causes of those conflicts won't be solved. And unless and until you solve those root causes, you're only managing the violence, managing the death. And you can get it down to a more reasonable level, perhaps, but you're not going to solve it. And as soon as we stop, it's going to come right back, and it's going to come back as bad as it ever has.
Well, I guess a lot of people would hear that and say, yeah, we should go in and get it down to a manageable level, even if that's all we can do. What do you say to that?
Well, again, it's an understandable impulse, but it's not the whole part of the story. I mean, you have to remember the dramatic cost, both to us and to the combatants that's involved in that. So kind of what people like to talk about, this notion that somehow the Iraq War had been won back before the troops left. We spent several $1 trillion in Iraq. 4,500 Americans, give or take, lost their lives. But more to the point, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives in all the suffering. So it's not as if there was some sort of a magic easy switch in which you got to the end of that suffering. It was dramatically costly. And from, everything I've seen, I don't think the American public's particularly interested in paying those costs again. And so there's people who like to talk as if you were going to get that same outcome with simply dropping some Hellfire missiles off of a drone, or maybe flying a couple F-16s or B-1 bombers over the battlefield and dropping some bombs. That's not the reality. The reality is that you're trading some security on our side of that equation for insecurity on the other side. Bombs inevitably miss their targets. The human suffering is inevitably bad. But on top of that, the enemy that is out there, ISIS, wants nothing more than for this to be a fight about them and the West. They want it to be about something that they can go to Sunnis and they can say, who are you with here? Are you with us or are you with the Americans? We're your tribesmen. We're your brothers. Aren't you with us, not the Americans? And that's the battle they want. If we're not there for them to make the enemy of, no one wants to live under these guys. No one wants to live with this kind of brutal dictatorship, this kind of mass beheadings and executions and completely horrific violence. But the ability they have to point to others and say, you're in a fight with others, whether it's us, whether it's the Shiite government in Baghdad, whether it's the Kurds, whether it's Assad's government, to point to someone else and say, you're on our side, not their side, so join with us in fighting them. That's what they want. That's the only way they're able to stay in power. I just wrote something that said, this is a movement that can only survive during war. They thrive off war. They want nothing more than a fight. They do things like behead an American to get us to join the fight. They want us to come bomb them so that they can make it about us instead of being about them.
Well, I think that's a terrific point. I mean, I think that sort of sadly, we're the universally despised enemy there, and they give themselves something like global stature if they can say, as Bin Laden was able to say, I've taken on the most powerful country in the world, and they acknowledge me as an adversary worth fighting. That creates an enormous amount of stature as well as a common enemy. So I think that tactically that's a terrific point, an extremely important point. But then it's going to come back to, because we are altruistic people, many of us who want to do the right thing, what do we do? What do we ask our government to do? I in a commentary earlier, I said that I thought that multi-party solutions were much more appropriate in this situation, that we should be trying to convene regional talks maybe, or bring in multiple parties to address this issue. Certainly we've withdrawn support for the last government in Iraq, but the Maliki government. But what should people be wanting their country to do in a case like this?
Well, this is one area where I think the Obama administration's done some things right, and they've got some more things that they need to do. So they have tried to have some more regional conversations. They've been talking to parties in the neighborhood, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like the Gulf states, like Jordan. These are countries that have a deeply vested interest in what's going on, and at times they've been incredibly counterproductive, to the point that even some of them, there's allegations that they were supporting ISIS. They were, supplying weapons and supplying funds, less so now, but in the early days. But having those parties at the conversation, and that includes the Iranians, for example. We tried to have a peace process for Syria, which didn't acknowledge that the Iranians had a voice in the debate. Well, that's a recipe for failure. That would be like the British trying to have a peace agreement between the Irish and the British without involving the Irish. You can't do it. They're part of the conversation. They're part of what's going on. But there's a role here for the United Nations that we haven't fully explored. We have the United Nations for situations like this. We haven't taken this issue to the United Nations. If there is a need for military action at some point, and there may be at some point, then there's a role for the world to come together because everyone agrees on the fundamentals of what needs to be done and say we should do that. We haven't seen that fully pursued. It needs to be fully pursued. And the last thing is there's a tremendous amount of suffering that will be alleviated not with bombs but with food, water, shelter, and supplies. One of the things that I was very heartened to see my government do was people were dying on a mountain, starving and dying of thirst. We gave them food and water. That's an amazing thing, and that saved several thousand lives, and we should be proud of that. There's many more lives that need to be saved, not through any sort of military action, but just on the basic needs of food and water. The UN just confirmed that kind of the humanitarian crisis just from the Syrian conflict alone with 3 million refugees is something that just has never existed on this scale for this long. There's tremendous need, and the U.S. should lead the world and live our values. We've been doing a good job, but we need to keep doing it. We need to take care of that humanitarian crisis by providing for those basic fundamental needs.
Well, that sounds like a great approach to a tragic and situation that will take a long time to heal, but emphasize humanitarian actions and the role of the United Nations. So thanks for discussing this tragic situation with us, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a good weekend.